This webinar is going to cover 8 considerations you should keep in mind to get your global ledger design right. It should be a very straightforward webinar. We encourage questions and hope that you find this information helpful as you start thinking of how the move to CloudSuite Financials might impact your global ledger structure. We're going to be talking a little bit about some dimension basics and what typical use cases are before diving into what these design considerations are, and then obviously we'll take questions. First, we have an About RPI slide. We are an Infor Alliance partner, and we like taking group pictures, and we like doing cool work, and we like working with Infor CloudSuite Financials. So dimensions. If I ask my good friends, the elves behind Wikipedia, about dimensions, they tell me that it's something fairly complex that helps me locate, provides the coordinates to locate something in a space or surface. Fortunately for us, in the case of CloudSuite Financials, dimensions simply mean the GL code block. It's a word that gets thrown around a lot. But basically, if you look at old school Lawson, they would have been company, accounting unit, account, activity, and account category. And in some ways, these were fairly fixed and rigid. And now we have a lot of flexibility with these. So, you might consider when you move to CloudSuite Financials, changing it up, getting rid of the account category, adding a class and a practice, renaming your activity project, and renaming your accounting unit department or cost center. So that's really what we're talking about, is that potential change. Or maybe you have really complex reporting requirements on your industry, and there's a lot of things you need to track, including what types of money you're using and where they come from, so that you can report back on them. All right. So now, what are we looking at here, Cindy?
We're looking at the available dimensions that CloudSuite Financials gives us. We have 4 at the top, which are the N4 created, and the ones at the bottom are the user-created dimensions. We do have 2 dimensions that are always required on a transaction. Those are going to be the accounting entity and the account. And the rest of them can be optional, but you can choose to make them required or not.
The accounting entity is what we would typically refer to as a company.
Yes. Accounting unit, they move that terminology on over. It can mean accounting unit. You can use a dimension to accomplish that same thing as well. And then you do have account and project. Project would be replacing the old activity.
Old activity.
Yep.
And then there's also a sub-account, optional sub-account that we're going to talk about in a second. So what that looks like in FSM setup is like that. So this is the finance structure, which lives at the finance enterprise group. So this is global, right? It's not under the company. And you can see here, the accounting entity, in this case, has been renamed business entity. Usually we call that company. The accounting unit is not in use, and there's 2 user dimensions that have been flagged. You can see there's an order, and as Cindy mentioned, you can select whether it's required upon all entry or not. And then based on whatever you have chosen here and your naming conventions, it's going to rename the tabs on the left, and every single GL code block on a transaction screen for journal entries, invoices, purchase orders, requisitions is going to reflect what you have set up. So in this case, business entity, account, grant, cost center, project. If we were to take these and switch them up, maybe add a few dimensions, use the accounting unit and call it class, it would change that transaction level to reflect what we have. And the order they appear in is the order that we have selected here, which you can select at the beginning, but once you start having transactions, you can't rearrange. Always add a new dimension later. So one of the early questions I got is, well, what do I need any of these dimensions for? Well, you might not but there's a couple of sort of low-hanging fruit, easy use cases. One is you might be using smart numbering somewhere in your current GL code block. For example, and I'm not saying this is you, but some people, you might have in your accounting unit some sort of smart key that is identifying different things within that numeric structure. For example, maybe this 9-digit code block includes a region, a facility, and a department. And when you migrate to CloudSuite Financials, you would be able to break that out into 3 separate pieces of the code block. Now, there's some obvious efficiencies in doing so, right, Cindy?
There
Yes.
are.
I'm going to think about that one. Yeah.
There are some efficiencies in doing that. You can do, your reporting becomes quite easy to do. You can have different hierarchies of those dimensions and do a lot of different roll-ups using those hierarchies, which you could never do using the old
Oh, yeah, and less
version.
maintenance, too, because you don't have to create every single iteration of
Correct.
number combinations or update them when I get a new facility. Now I have to add 1,000. You just add one
Right.
facility and rules will govern something else. And, the other side of this is basically any place that you might want to streamline reporting. So things that you are using attributes for, things that you are importing data into a third-party system to slice and dice, or things that people in your organization might be doing ad hoc. You might be able to use a dimension, not always, right? We want to make sure that we use dimensions where they're applicable in order to more efficiently retrieve that data. Every single dimension gets embedded into a series of cubes that are used for reporting purposes, where it's an indexing field, which basically means it makes querying that data faster. And sort of simplistic view, this is a series of drop downs for a self-service income statement. So think of one of those GL290s or something like that.
Right.
And you can see not only do I have certain things like my ledger and I guess I don't have my counter here, but I have all the dimensions that I've set up as filters that I can use, summary, posting, or choose to ignore as I retrieve data. Cool. All right, so now we're going to talk about some design considerations. Probably the most powerful thing from our perspective that CloudSuite Financials is going to offer Lawson customers is the ability to have multiple hierarchies, right? So here we see traditional hierarchy where I have posting level and I have 3 summary levels.
Yes.
And I can have that, retain that exactly as is, but in addition, have a second alternate hierarchy that rolls up the posting accounts, account units, or dimensions differently. Right? This might solve a lot of your reporting problems as well. Maybe something that you use attributes for to be able to pull
Absolutely.
certain, say, accounting units. Now you can just have a roll-up that specifically chooses the ones you want to include, because you do not have to include all the accounts, accounting units, or dimensions in your hierarchies. You can have subsets. So that is cool. All right. The second big consideration is the accounting unit dimension. So these hierarchies that you set up, that you can set multiple of, they get set up globally across all companies except for the accounting unit. The accounting unit's hierarchies, just as flexible, they get set up under the company. So if I have 200 companies and I use the same accounting unit structure for all of them, it probably is more maintenance than I need to have this set up 200 times. And I probably want to move the AU or department or cost center somewhere into one of the user dimensions where I can manage it globally. Now, if I have a dimension or cost center or field that is company specific and I do want to maintain by company, then that can be a valuable field as well.
Absolutely. Particularly if you were a single company entity, that definitely would be where you want to use that. if you are multi-company, I think it makes more sense to move
Yeah.
it down.
Yeah, I think there's some recommendations in terms of
Yes.
maintenance. It's a consideration. It's going to depend on what your organization looks like, but you definitely don't want to just slam your accounting unit in the accounting unit and then realize, oh, I'm creating a lot of work for myself that I didn't need to create.
Right.
So remember, this isn't required by default. You could name this accounting unit, require it, and make it the third in your GL code block, and it will look exactly the same. All that's changing is the maintenance. And here, just a quick screenshot of the accounting unit structure living under the company. It's funny because when you look at it in that original tab and you're like, where's my accounting unit structure? And you finally click on the company and that's what you get. Additionally, pretty important, there are some dimension restrictions. So maybe Cindi, you wanna walk us through some of these.
Certainly. Zone balancing, you can only do zone balancing in 2 dimensions. You can certainly do it at the accounting unit level, which is under the company piece, or you can do it at the user dimension 1. So if you have a need, in our example prior, we moved accounting unit down to user dimension. We would want to definitely put it at user dimension 1 if you want to do zone balancing at that level.
Right, and zone balancing gets used very typically for operations that are operating as a single company but have a need to track multiple balance sheet
Correct.
items, right?
Correct. Different funding sources sometimes.
Okay. And I know that's out there. It's not, I wouldn't say it's super common, at least in my experience, but definitely it's out there. I wonder if we'll see less of that because some of the decisions that drove it to single company might now change when you go to CloudSuite Financials.
Right.
But as a default, to be safe, if you're breaking out the accounting unit from the system delivered, user field 1 is a good choice, right? Because you know they've already built in some stuff to accommodate that accounting unit functionality. Okay. And you never know when you might need to use that for something. Number 2, and this one I guess might be a little bit obvious, but just in case, there's only one, this is supposed to say reserved for project ledger. There's only one dimension that works for the project ledger, and that is your project or activity dimension. What I would say is if you do not use projects or activities today, that's totally fine. You probably want to save that,
Yes.
right? Don't use it because you never know in the future, and projects are awesome to track. So likewise,
User dimension 2 is reserved for your billing and revenue recognition. That's where you can do project invoicing. So if you happen to use BR today, you definitely would be using user dimension 2 to do that functionality that you currently are using in AC.
and even if you're not, you probably just want to save it.
I agree.
Yeah, okay. Awesome. So super flexible, remember, it's a super flexible global ledger structure, and you can always add new dimensions, right? So when you look at your new design, you don't want to create dimensions for the sake of creating them. We advise to try to keep it simple. You're going to be re-educating your entire organization on coding this stuff. And you can use other things like the hierarchies and also user fields.
Correct.
to meet your reporting requirements. Like there's certain cases when dimensions will make sense and others where they might not. But once you decide what they are, just make sure you don't use up one of the ones that's reserved for special functionality. All right, we mentioned this earlier. So the order is totally flexible until
You have transactions
you have
entered.
transactions. So
And then our order, we're stuck with it. However, as you add new ones, you can certainly order those however you want after that.
just
But-
as long as they go after the ones you
After,
already have, so
right.
you kind of can't really do much with it. So.
Right.
And the order is really about what's going to make sense from a visual perspective. I would guess that most folks would follow the company, cost center, account.
Yeah, definitely the
Model.
items that are required, you want to make sure those are in the first
Front.
order of your
Yeah.
code block, and then those that might not be required for all transactions.
Put 'em
those
towards
towards
the
the end.
All right, Cindy, maybe you want to walk us through the sub-account.
Yeah, sub-accounts. Current Lawson world, sub-accounts can be used multiple times to represent multiple different things. For example, in the first section here, we have 100 sub-account meaning inpatient and 200 meaning outpatient. And then we've used it down again in office supplies, and 100 means best supplies and 200 means not the best.
I hate buying not the best.
That can no longer happen. So if you're using sub-accounts and you want to move to continue using sub-accounts, you're going to have to do some restructuring in your sub-account structure, because now we define a sub-account and it means the same thing regardless of what account it's used on. So we would have to create additional sub-accounts to capture our best supplies and not the best supplies.
So they're universal numbers, and they're indexing fields in the cube as well. That's why they're considered a dimension, even though technically they're a sub-account. So I think there are organizations that use sub-accounts that already have, they're already unique identifiers, if you will.
Yes.
And again, you could reuse them. They're just going to mean the same thing wherever you put them.
Well, and your description on your account is going to say whatever you defined that original one to
Exactly.
say. So it's going to make
So
no
you can
sense.
use inpatient office supplies.
Yeah.
Which maybe makes sense in a context that I don't happen to know. Now, another consideration is there's a lot of flexibility here in terms of what these look like, right? So historically, and you can correct me here if I'm wrong, Cindy, accounting units have had to be numeric, posting accounting units, and posting accounts, and summary have been alphanumeric. And it's made a lot of sense to keep those alpha because you can very easily tell that it's a summary versus posting. So I kind of like that. But any which way, there's a lot of flexibility now in how you structure all these. For example, at RPI, we got a little code that means our department. It's a 2-digit number and a dash and then a word. And that's what we like. And you could do this here as well. And it's completely unrestricted, right? Alphanumeric, I assume there's some level of characters, probably 30, that you can get to. But if you want to enforce a system, you can do so with this regular expression setting, right? So what this is these are Java expressions. And I'm no pro on Java, but I called up Richard Stout and I got some codes here. And so, for example, what this is saying is that our company is going to be alpha between A and Z, and then followed by 2 digits. We use W14. Our account is going to have 5 digits. Cindy doesn't like this setup because, in particular here, it's not keeping me from having leading zeros. And we know leading zeros are a bane of the existence of anybody that's put them into Excel, right? Because it drops them.
Right.
And then the class here is 2 digits followed by a dash, and then as many letters as it'll let you fit in. And so whatever, it's a consideration that this is in here. You can determine what you want this to be. Now, you don't have to put this in to make them whatever you want, right? So this is a control mechanism, which Cindy doesn't think is necessary because
you typically control who can add
centralized,
new, right? It's very centralized, and you control who can add new ones. This really would be useful if you have 10 people creating an account number and you want to make sure they all follow the same rules.
Yeah, or they fat finger a lot of stuff.
Right.
Okay, cool. So moving on. So one of the things that gets a little bit more complicated is the relationships between this geocode block. So traditionally, we have associated specific accounts with accounting units, right? So these are the valid combinations. These are valid expense accounts for a department. This is your GL20, your GL20.2. And I think conceptually a lot of us can understand that, right? So what happens here is when I add a dimension, I have to consider that it might have a specific set of relationships with some accounting units, cost centers, or departments, and also some accounts. And you can see how it could get complicated in a hurry if I was to continue to add dimensions, each of which might have specific relationships between them, right? The good news is they don't have to, right? So you can have a dimension that only comes into effect, with a specific other dimension or account or accounting unit. Like I only want to use this for income statement accounts.
Correct.
And when you build these, there are ways to automate, build the rules, do it at a summary level, upload. The building of the detail has actually not been very challenging at all. I think the exercise that's important is sort of the whiteboard concept of, I'm using this to track X, say tenants, because I lease office space. And so these are the accounts that goes with, right? As long as we understand that, all this sort of works itself out.
Right. This comes into play when you're creating what's required, what's not required.
Mm-hmm.
So this is where it's very important to understand what relationships you need to make.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because what's required is based on something else along the way.
Right.
And I'll just point out real quickly that if this had existed a long time ago, we might not have balance sheet accounting units are default everywhere, right? And for most organizations, they don't really mean anything. It's just a placeholder because there isn't a department that cash or AP or AR belongs to. And so I've seen very often the 999, but I'm sure there's some other combinations. Then if you have 4 levels, you got the summary 3 levels. We've all gotten so used to typing that in. But in theory, you don't need to have a balance sheet accounting unit because you already know it's a balance sheet account. That's a summary account. And you could have had cost centers or departments for your income statement only. Now, I'm not saying that there's benefits to force that change upon your organizations, but just think of that conceptually. It's like, where do I need this and why? And you want to try to simplify entry where possible. So when you're creating these relationships, you also want to you want to specify where they're required and also where they're not allowed.
Right.
So, and this can be done through rules and
Right.
and uploads and so forth. Here we go. Balance sheet accounts might not require Department AU. So, in summary, it's very exciting. That's very cool stuff to talk about and think about. And most of the information to do this ultimately doesn't come from us, right? It comes from your business. You know what stuff would be really helpful to track, and maybe different people in your organization do. And what we can do is help facilitate the conversation of whether that really makes sense in a dimension or some other way, and what the pluses and minuses might be. Generally speaking, less is more. We're not advising people to create 14-dimension code blocks that they got to retrain their whole organization on. And you should really focus on, I had a question, how do I make sure I get them right? Focus on what your pain point is today. If you don't have any pain points and everything's working perfectly, then keep the ones that you have, right? You can always add more later. And again, it's all about addressing reporting needs, and smart numbering stuff is super low-hanging fruit. Maybe you want to track hospital as a dimension, and you have that embedded into your accounting unit or a summary accounting unit. There are some alternatives for like attributes. The main things the first thing that we look at is like, talk to me about your reporting, your reporting tools, and what do you have attributes for, right? That's like Cindy's first question.
Yeah. Attributes go away.
Attributes go away, but that doesn't mean they get replaced with dimensions.
Correct. Could be hierarchies, could be dimensions, could be user fields.
User fields. User fields, they get configured in, but in theory, so before you had user fields that were predefined because if they weren't there, then you'd have to modify a table. But the way that CloudSuite Financials work is you can add user fields basically anywhere. That's just how the system is configured to work. And then we recommend whiteboarding relationships between dimensions, just to sort of get the concepts down, and all the details are actually they're really not bad to set up.
The details are easy. It's the conceptual part of it that's hard.
All right, now we see if we got any questions out there. All right, well, we appreciate you taking the time to attend this webinar. We hope you found it informative, and we hope to get the opportunity to learn what you guys are thinking about and what you might do with your migration to CloudSuite Financials. Yes, sir. Somebody throw something at him.
We have levels and have not seen this ever addressed.
I'm sorry?
Someone says we have levels and have not seen this ever addressed.
Levels are in the, like, I guess they're talking about they have levels in their structure, in their organization structure, and the hierarchies accommodate some of that leveling. Level addresses goes away.
Right.
It's really built based off the hierarchies that you build when you create your structures.
So you can, we're not sure we understand. The question is, we have levels and have not seen this addressed, and we're not totally sure we understand the question, but you can recreate those levels as your accounting unit summary structure.
In your
if it's
hierarchy.
important to you, right? I mean, there's no level addressing because it's not needed, but you could use the same sort of
Correct.
number sequence and make those the summaries and have that if you're pulling reporting that way or something. Thank you guys very much. Thank you, Cindy.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.